Warning. This podcast is about the realities of working in people operations. This is not a stuck-up, PC, compliance-based, or employment law podcast about stuffy, outdated HR practices. Shit will get real here, and we assume no responsibility.
People are not very self-reflective, full stop. Like, in life in general,
really
like...
And then all of a sudden you take an assessment, which is like looking in a mirror and you're like, oh, I like these things. Oh, I don't like this thing. So it's not true. And it's like, well, that thing may be just as true as these other things.
This is the People Problems Podcast with Alexa Baggio and Tyson McKenzie.
What's up, Tyson?
Not too much. I feel like I'm like really over caffeinated. Like, you know, when you have like your regular coffee and then like you wait a bit and then you're like, okay, I think I could like have like one more of like the usual, and then it's just like you're shaking, vibrating, and like a little bit manic. So that's where I'm at today. So this is gonna be fun.
Nice. Manic Tyson. I can't wait. This is exciting for us. Cool. Yeah, I sometimes have that issue because I don't typically eat breakfast, so I get and this morning I've gone for a run and I haven't eaten, and so like my hands are cold and I've had too much coffee, and so I get I get the shakes. I don't have the I feel like I'm bouncing off the walls like Tigger over caffeinated though. I just have, like, the physical
just
shakes.
like you can like feel like your heart pumping.
Yeah. The heart rate is
your
like
chest. Pretty sure I can hear my heart pumping right now.
Yeah.
So.
Nice.
Oh man, I also added like this like Starbucks pumpkin spice creamer, which like is pretty much like liquid poison.
I was gonna say that has to have sugar in it. Yeah.
It's just the worst shit for you, honestly. But you know, c'est la vie.
Yeah, creamer is usually never.
I never. It's like my one thing is this pumpkin spice. I only drink it this time of year. But usually I never drink like sugary coffee. But anyways.
Getting your fall betch on, I love it.
Got to.
You got to. All right. Well, while you're caffeinating over there or decaffeinating, let me remind everyone that today's episode is brought to you by our listener community, the People Ops Society. Join our community to use the forum for peer feedback, download awesome resources written and shared by your peers, and get access to free courses all included. Use the code PeopleProblems at peopleopsociety.com to get 20% off your membership. Again, use the code PeopleProblems at peopleopsociety.com to join our community. And please make sure to follow us on all things social at People Problems Pod, at HR Shook, and at The Influencer spelled with an HR. You can follow us on YouTube and you can follow us on YouTube, and obviously make sure to subscribe to our weekly newsletter, People Problems, at peopleproblemspod.com. In addition, we're going to be announcing in our next episode that we are starting a hotline, Tyson.
Ooh, that gives me such like a 90s vibe. I love it.
I know. It's very 90s,
super nostalgic.
But it's also like I feel like all HR stories are better said in spoken word than in like text or writing or DM. Like you just get so much more color. And obviously it's anonymous. It will be an anonymous hotline, but have had enough people indicate the intention of giving us stories that the hotline has to happen. So
Hotline Bling, stories.
Hotline Bling starting next episode.
Yes.
Keep your ears peeled for the People Problems hotline, where you can tell us all your crazy shit anonymously for future episodes. So
fun.
Yeah. All right. I'm gonna move us to In the News because we haven't done it in the news in a while. This week's story is a New York Times article that came out saying companies hoarding workers could be good news for the economy. So, long story short, the article basically references that there are parts of the world where currently, as of this recording, the unemployment rate here in the United States is at 3.5%. We just added a bunch of jobs. The jobs reports are strong. Obviously, people are anticipating a recession and that will change. But this article references that a fair amount of small businesses and largely I'd say mid-market businesses are actually hoarding workers because it's been so hard to find labor, and that the turnover rates are still lagging basically the labor market a bit. And so, there's a couple different opinions here about like, is this good? Is this not good? Should you like be keeping people even if they're poor performers, and sort of the implications of that. But it is interesting to think about companies, quote unquote, hoarding workers. What do you think, Tyson?
Yeah, I guess like my brain is just exploding a little bit with this like juxtaposition of having like a great resignation that is like very tightly followed by this pending supposed recession.
Yes.
That I understand your president doesn't believe is happening. I'm pretty sure my prime minister is encouraging. But anyways, politics aside,
let's definitely don't trust politicians with the economy. That's step number one.
For sure. But anyways, so we've got this, like, we're stuck in this like weird gray space in the middle right now where people are like, okay, like there's still this remnants, like as per the article, I'm guessing this remnants of the Great Recession still happening. Turnover is still high. I don't know if I'm seeing that necessarily, but like if that's sort of like generally what the people are saying. But then it's also like, oh shit, like, so we don't want to lose people, but also like we could be in a position where we have to, you know, make adjustments because of the economy. I just think it's like a really interesting time right now. And I think people are just kind of like sitting tight and seeing what's happening. And I think the best thing that people can do in this situation is just not to make any rash decisions, of course, and just make sure that every decision is made with like thought and intent. So you mentioned there, like holding on to poor performers, I don't think is ever a good idea regardless. But so just things like that, like really, really, really thinking through any sort of like mass hiring or mass firing is just, you know, we want to just kind of like wait and see. And maybe that's what this article is getting at, is people, it's maybe not hoarding, so to speak, but it's like, okay, let's just
pause. Yeah,
let's just
everyone
pause.
Let's idle.
Let's just chill a hot sec before we make any rash decisions, which I think is good.
Yeah, I also think, you know, as with all things, there are nuances to this conversation, which is like these are largely, a lot of the examples in the article are largely like service-based industries where people can be very hard to find, people can be very hard to keep, you know, and so before, to your point, you go let go of a bunch of workers because you're anticipating like a seasonal change or something, you might want to remember the last time that you had to hire those people back. It was not as easy. It took longer and it was more expensive, right? Or that on average, if you have 10 workers and the current resignation you know, continues, you're going to lose 3-4 of those workers no matter what you do. So rather than doing it ahead of time, you may just sort of let that attrition happen naturally. So yeah, I think it's just, I think nice for people to take, and I realize that you're not really allowed to do this in business. It's taboo, but like you're not allowed to take a breath and pause and say, hold on a second, before we, you know, hire, fire, etc. Like, let's see where the tectonic plates underneath us are going. And so in a way, yeah, I think it's interesting. It's also, again, I think very industry driven. So it really depends what industry you're in, that these things can be harder or more, you know, more possible to hoard workers, right? So it's interesting. It's worth a read. But also, where the fuck are we all going?
Where are we going?
What's gonna happen in the next 6 months? All I know is that it'll make for interesting podcasts. Because
I should consult my tarot cards.
Exactly. We have to do it. We have to do a tarot episode. We've talked about this. Just you know, crystals and tarot, just to make sure everyone knows you're sufficiently really into that shit.
It's the only thing you can count on these days. Okay.
Is that Tyson believes in tarot and crystals? Yep, that's the only thing I count on. The only truth in this world is Tyson's love of crystals and tarot. All right. The other thing we love here on People Problems is having guests. So I'm going to take this opportunity to introduce our guest. Our guest today is Eric Kersach. He is the owner of Harmony Insights and the founder of HR Hot Seat. Eric is a credited actor on IMDb. Can't wait to hear more about that. An occasional backup singer for Josh Groban and a 2-time Chicago marathoner. He also builds HR community, helps individuals and organizations leverage the DISC personality assessment, and he believes in the power of meaningful connection to shape lives and transform careers. Eric, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited. I've been listening to your conversation. I'm excited to dive into all of this.
Any immediate thoughts? Anything you just like can't wait to say?
Well, I mean, given the work that I do around personality styles, what I'm seeing is companies attempting to be a little bit more intentional about having the right people in the right place. You know, so as we're trying to engage employees and, you know, the ping pong tables aren't working the way that they used to in terms of building culture and engagement. You know, I was just with an organization earlier this week that talked about, you know, well, is it possible that we have the wrong, you know, how is it the people on the right bus, but maybe in the wrong seats, you know? So if we leave them in the wrong seats, eventually they're going to say, you know what, I think I might pack up my things and leave because I might have a better fit elsewhere, better opportunity elsewhere. But if we get people in the right seats based on their communication and personality style, for example, or the environments in which they do their best work, maybe we can hold on to some of these folks a little bit longer. And I don't think it takes a pandemic to ask that question, but I think for a lot of organizations, they've had to get really creative about how they're engaging and keeping the talent that they want to have around.
Yep. Right people, right role, right reason. That's what we talk about around here.
That's HR, yeah.
That's HR, man. That's all it is. People want some big, we just had a brainstorm recently with a POPs member who was trying to talk about how to roll out like more professional development in their organization. It was like, you guys are doing a lot of stuff. Like, this isn't about more process or more meetings or more this is just about sitting down with your managers and making sure that they know how to talk to their people about growth and what's interesting, and that they're like teaching people. And it's just so funny that people forget. They try to overcomplicate all this stuff, and it's like, it's not. It's the right people in the right places for the right reasons. So you mentioned DISC. Go ahead.
There's a lot worth considering, but I think a lot of it just comes down to opening up lines of communication, and so much can be accomplished just by doing that alone.
Yes. Well, it's fascinating because in that conversation we were talking about like how engineers manage versus how some of us less technical humans manage. But you mentioned DISC, and I know you are an expert in the field. And Tyson, and I mean this in the most loving way possible, is not familiar with DISC. So today we get to teach Tyson and the rest of the world about DISC assessments. So Eric, do us a favor just to set the stage here for a much larger conversation. Give everyone a little bit of the overview of DISC, and then how it is a helpful, basically the overview of how it is a helpful tool and what it is used for, please.
DISC is one of the more popular personality/behavioral assessments out there. And some people refer to it as personality, some in terms of behavior. I don't get particular about that, but it certainly is an assessment. It's not a test. As soon as somebody calls it a test, I jump in and correct them. There's no right or wrong when it comes to this stuff. It's a common language for helping us understand ourselves and other people, helping us do our best work, and connecting really meaningfully with our stakeholders at any level. In a nutshell, that's what DISC helps us do.
I love it. And so let's tell people a little bit about the format of DISC. So and they're not necessarily comparables. I realize all these assessments do different things. But Myers-Briggs, what's the other one? There's something called, is it Ocean? I don't know. There's different assessments there's so many, but there's some well-known ones. But let's explain to everyone what the DISC actually stands for.
Sure. So DISC is made up of 4 primary styles, D, I, S, and C. D is dominance, very direct and decisive and competitive and time sensitive. They feel they're of value to the world if they make progress. I is influencing, very actively paced like the D or dominant style, but now we're more focused on people rather than tasks. So we're valuing relationships, and we're energetic, and we're optimistic, and sort of the cheerleaders of the group. And we're of value if we're liked, if we're social beings, if we're well networked. The S or steadiness style is still focused on people, but instead of being actively paced like the influencing style, now we're dialed back a little bit. We're more relaxed. We are really good listeners and accommodating, and feel that we're of value if we are first and foremost of service to other people. Somewhat conflict averse. Some would say change averse. And I've heard people who prefer this style say, we're not change averse, we're systematic. We want to know that there's something in place to get us from point A to point B. And then lastly, the C or conscientiousness style is a value to the world if they're right, if they're accurate. So sort of buttoned up, kind of corporate about things, T's crossed and I's dotted. They might feel that there's no real place for emotion in the workplace because they speak a language of logic, of black and white, like the dominant style. We're a mixture of all 4 styles. We gravitate toward 1 or 2 primarily, sometimes 3. But what I love about DISC is it reminds us we have some agency, that we can choose a communication style in any given moment that's going to be beneficial to us and our stakeholders.
I am a high D, high I. I know that's not going to come as a shock to anyone. I wish I was a high I, high S, I think. I think that would be my preference, but I don't, maybe it's possible to move those things.
I feel like I resonate with that though. The D, I'm also D and I think.
Yeah, you and I are very similar, Tyson.
Yeah.
For better or for worse. Which I'm sure everyone who listens to this knows. But it's interesting because when I took this, Eric, I took this assessment in a training. This was many, many years ago, where the instructor and the teacher, first and foremost, they I'm sure you see this a lot. They did the thing where they changed the D, I, S, and C to like different bird types. So it was like you were an owl or an eagle or a parrot or I don't remember what they were.
It's just a different brand of disc.
Yeah, it's just a way of like giving it personality, I think. But what I found was that it was actually really helpful once we sat down and thought about it. Not only just what are you, but what are your colleagues? So you say, oh, I didn't, Matt's actually got a kind of a bit of like C in him, which would explain why he and I get into it so often. But he's coming at it from like a much more technical point of view than I am. So like now I just know that, and now I'm like, oh, this isn't you being a dick. This is just you. This is just how you communicate. Like, you need to convey that you're right about this, and I'm just trying to make decisions, right? It's a really helpful tool in just like giving people like, oh, here's the tools everybody's working with. Like now you can interpret people's communication not personally or just interpret it at all. And so I found it to be very helpful. I'm curious how, before we go more into like how it's beneficial and why it's interesting and what people realize with it, is how did you get into this? Like, how does one become a disc expert and why?
I mean, the way so many people get into so many things, especially when you talk about HR and talent acquisition, and you get so many people saying, I kind of fell into it. And I was a psychology major in school. So, I graduate from college. I end up in a HR assistant role with a restaurant company based here in Chicago. And I'm doing HR generalist things. I stayed there for a total of 16 years altogether. And along the way, sort of picked up, as one does, the DISC personality assessment as one of the things that I would facilitate. And now I'm just going to play my own cards. I'm on the introverted side of things. And so when my boss came to me and said, hey, you have an interest in this, I would love for you to facilitate DISC to up to 70 new managers and chefs at a given time, I nearly crawled under my desk. It was a little nerve-wracking for me, but I was just passionate enough about this topic that I really took to it. And needless to say now, I've stepped out of that corporate HR role and have built a business around DISC, but it's something that kind of fell into my lap, and I didn't turn back. I fell in love with it. And, even now after 16 years, I still get just as excited talking about DISC as I did the first day that I happened upon the model.
Yeah.
You know what I find so interesting about, I'm just going to double click on something you said. It's so interesting about people like calling themselves introvert or extrovert. And I know that this isn't necessarily like a DISC thing, but I think that often it's like, I used to always think I was an extrovert because I like to talk to people, whatever. But like, as I've gotten older, it's very, very clear to me how introverted I actually am. And where I discovered this was, I guess, like the explanation of introvert is actually where you're getting energy.
Your energy, yeah.
So it's like, do you get energy when you're sort of like alone, or do you get energy when you're with other people? And I'm like, oh my God, being with other people just absolutely exhausts me. So like, yes, I can present like an extrovert and I can get up on the mic or like be in a group of people, work the room. But at the end of the day, I need like downtime to like, recharge. So it's interesting with like some of these things, and I don't know if this is like something about like personality tests where we kind of say like, oh, I'm this, and we're kind of like putting ourselves into a box, and like we have this expectation of what is that, self-fulfilling prophecy or something like that. Anyways, so I maybe we'll talk about this a little bit more, but like I'm interested a bit about that as well, like putting people into boxes with these types of things.
So we could park in this whole introversion, because I do a lot of speaking on the topic of introversion. So we could spend some time here if you want. But I like your latter point.
You do an extroverted activity about being an introvert as an introvert. Got it. Okay.
I think it's called extroverted introvert.
I will say, sort of as an aside to that Susan Cain, who wrote the book Quiet, which is one of the two best books I've read on the topic of introversion, was on work-life. I think the Work Life podcast with Adam Grant. And she was saying, one of the most common misconception about introverts is that they don't get energized by being with people, that we all get energy in some way by being with other people. Right. I have found personally, Eric has found recently that I used to use that same definition. It's about where we get our energy. And I've now gravitated toward a slightly different definition, which Adam Grant also espouses, which has more to do with what you do with stimulation, how you're impacted by stimulation. I think James Clear is his name, who wrote the book Atomic Habits,
Yep.
talks about how even in the nursery, when babies are born in the hospital, when a loud sound is played, those babies who end up identifying as extroverts later in life will turn toward that sound. The babies who later in life identify with being on the introverted side of things will turn away from it. And I like that stimulation piece and that stimulation definition, because when we're focused on where we get our energy, to say, well, I don't get my energy from other people isn't entirely true. I do, but I'm going to want a more intimate conversation. I will get
How much stimulation?
quite a bit of energy from this discussion, but similar to you, Tyson, if I'm thrown in a room with 100 people that I don't know, or maybe 100 people I do know, eventually I'm either going to run screaming from the room or just fall asleep.
Yeah, that actually makes sense too, because like now as I'm like diagnosing myself, I'm thinking like what I really hate about being with other people is like the small talk, right? Like the tell me something interesting about yourself, I want to keel over and die.
Yes.
But if I'm engaging in a conversation like what we're doing right now, where I'm talking about something that I'm super interested in, like ask me to talk about HR, I'll be there all day, right?
Yes.
That I find really engaging, really energizing. So that actually makes a lot of sense. I love that perspective that you've provided. Yeah.
A through line through much of the work that I do, and the reason why I started the HR Hot Seat Mastermind community that I run, is this idea of meaningful connection. I was just tired of networking that felt superficial and transactional. I honestly don't think you have to be introverted to say that. I think that people of all shapes and sizes find networking to be transactional.
Yeah, I was going to say, as someone that
times.
most people would say is an extreme extrovert, even though I'm not, I'm actually very introverted as an extrovert. I get most of my energy and the stimulation I prefer is like a few people that I'm very close to, but I do like people. Like I went to dinner last night after working a 14-hour day with a friend, and like that was recharging for me, not like exhausting. But if it had been, let's go to like a networking function or a concert, I would have been like, nope, too much for me.
Yeah.
But I will say, like, it's a misconception that is the style that people always charge into, and that there's not more like of a nuanced gradient here, for sure.
And there's plenty, and this comes back to a point that Tyson was making. Well, first of all, there's this term ambivert as well, and this is a spectrum. It's not on off. There's something fallacy. I forget what it's called, but it's not like you're either introverted or extroverted.
Right.
There is a spectrum. And some people say, well, I'm ambiverted. I'm kind of in the middle. I don't really get caught up in that. Same with DISC. And this comes back to your point, Tyson, which I think was such a good one. I don't think we should label people. I don't think we should pigeonhole folks. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious why those things are detrimental. But I am very much a fan of language and of words and of common languages to help us have conversations. And that's what I say in my DISC workshops. DISC is just one potential common language to help us have a vitally important conversation about who we are. And we're much more than our DISC style. We're much more than whether we are introverted or extroverted, but we need a starting point. And if your starting point is DISC, fantastic. If it is, the latest quiz going around Facebook,
or your star sign, or your
star-
Enneagram, or I mean, there's 800 different ways to talk about different things.
Yeah, which Game of Thrones character
do you
identify as?
Exactly.
Whatever it is, if it leads to meaningful conversation about who we are and how we do our best work, I'm all for it.
Yeah.
Just don't assume that it's valid and reliable as a scientific tool if you're finding it on Facebook, because it's probably not.
Also that.
That aside, anything can work.
I definitely need a natal chart personally. I need to know what time you were born, when you were born, and where you were born so that we can properly have a good communication.
I will say I find most of that to be hooey, and I really love to tease Tyson about it, as people know. But I also think it is helpful because, do I believe in the astrology charts? I don't know. I have no idea if I actually believe in it. I am a textbook Leo based on every definition of it I've ever read. But what I do find, just to use a silly example to illustrate your point, Eric, is that it can be a helpful tool in getting someone to understand what you're talking about, or giving someone like a multi-dimensional tool that is easier than saying, I am this one thing. It's these tools allow people to communicate in saying, I am a part of a multi-dimensional thing, and here's where I fall in it. Or where I identify with it. So what I'm trying to tell you is that I fall on this part of the spectrum, right? Or I hold these traits very dear, or I have this kind of communication style, therefore I struggle with this other one, right? They're trying to give you context because these are all multi-dimensional assessments. They're also all, to say you are a Leo or to say you are a Virgo is to assume like 30 different things about a person, none of which are all true for anyone, regardless of what their star sign is. But same thing with DISC. I'm not all D and all I. Like everyone has an S and a C, right? And so it gives you. It's kind of like a layered way of communicating and giving people context that I think helps lessen the intensity and the unforgivingness of things like I'm an extrovert or I'm an introvert, which can be really harsh to people.
I think that's a wonderful point, and it's baked into the language of DISC. We say that we prefer one or another styles. As soon as you say it, I am a C, which I am, I prefer the C style, I'm putting myself in a corner, and it's a crutch. It's like, well, I'm not capable of stepping outside of my comfort zone. I'm incapable of connecting with you or leading you or selling to you or influencing you because I'm showing up with this particular style. And that's a fixed mindset. There's no growth there. And so the language we use is, well, I prefer this style.
Self-limiting belief.
Yeah, I prefer this style, and I am just as capable of anybody else at adapting or flexing. I can, my comfort zone tends to be that of someone who identifies as being introverted, but I have so much to learn from, my extroverted friends, and I may not become extroverted myself, but, I can adapt in ways that I learn things about me and about you that benefit both of us and certainly benefit our relationship.
What are some examples? Sorry, just before you go, we go into that. Like, what are some examples of people like recognizing that? Maybe more common workplace examples are helpful, like where these assessments are like, oh oh okay, I can do this better, or oh, I can learn from you. Like what's like some examples of how this gets implemented?
The first thing that comes to mind, because I've been working with a lot of sales teams, is there are some folks that shy away from the sales word, and they say, well, I don't know if I like
Everyone
that.
Thinks
I'm not
sales
sure.
is a dirty word.
I'm not sure,
So
which
ridiculous.
it isn't. I mean, it's not a negative thing. But some people just have their connotations, and maybe they've had a poor experience buying a used car. I don't know. But
Carvana, kids, Carvana. No humans involved.
So then you can make an assumption that, okay, in order to be good at sales, to thrive at sales, you have to show up with that influencing style where you're very actively paced and focused on people and relationships and energetic and can talk a million miles a minute. And if that's your perception of sales, I can understand why some people may be turned off by that. Well, as it turns out, all four styles can sell in different ways. So DISC then as a model says, all right, well, what if you show up with that S style? So you're still people focused, but you're not as actively paced. You're a better listener. Well, I might want you then selling a multi-million-dollar service over the course of 5 years, nurturing that relationship, because that's what you do, is you nurture relationships over time, and you're very steady in terms of how you go about your work. If I need to close the deal very quickly, I'm going to want somebody who's in that D or dominant style comfort zone. If I want a salesperson who's going to make sure that all T's are crossed and I's are dotted, I'm certainly going to call on somebody who's going to prefer that C or conscientiousness style, because there's no room for error in how we're presenting this sale. So that's just one example, I think, of where someone comes in and says, well, geez, I can't do that because I'm not fill in the blank. And then DISC reminds you, as it turns out, we each bring different strengths to, in this case, a sales role that can be beneficial.
I think that's super important to just going back to, I think, what Alexa was talking about at the beginning of this conversation, and that doing an exercise like this with a team and learning about one another, because you can see, we're not all the same. We each have like different strengths, and this is where we can sort of work together to, push a project over the finish line or that sort of thing, or even as a leader to their direct reports. Like, I need to sort of work with this person in a very specific way based on their styles. And I think you had mentioned, like, there's no style. It's not like we're all aiming to be, this exact, combination of DISC, right? So it's that we're all sort of different and like how to like work within that. But on top of that, I want to just like play a little bit of devil's advocate. So you mentioned now about, okay, if you want this type of job done, you're going to want this type of person. Using DISC as a recruitment tool. Let's talk about that. Is it recommended? Can I give all my, candidates a personality test?
People do that all the time.
You two are making
I know they do.
fantastic points. And this is a great question. And as it turns out, DISC is not a predictive assessment. There are some assessments out there that do predict performance in a role. I'm an authorized partner for Wiley. They're the world's leading publisher of DISC materials, and their brand is called Everything DISC. And it is not validated for recruiting for a couple of reasons. Primarily, I wouldn't say primarily. One of the reasons is that it is very easy to answer questions in very inauthentic ways. So if I think, Tyson is hiring me for a position and Tyson values relationships, I don't necessarily, but I'm going to answer the questions in such a way that Tyson believes that I value relationships, because that might be beneficial to me.
I'm applying for a multi-million-dollar enterprise sales role, and I know that it lends itself to needing high, S's or whatever we decided. I'm going to answer this test accordingly. That's
totally.
Yeah.
I hadn't thought of that.
So then from the perspective of the employer, then I'm getting information that I can't do anything with. So where I'm advising companies is to say, don't use it for the recruiting process. There are other assessments out there on the market that might be more beneficial to you, but certainly when the hiring decision has been made during the onboarding process and thereafter for ongoing professional development, say to your team members, it only benefits you to answer, to be authentic in how you answer the questions, because we're trying to set you up to do your best work, connect you with your colleagues, position you in all ways to do well with our organization. And then that's when I think DISC really comes to life. So if you're going to use any assessment for the recruiting or selection process, it's going to be one probably that is validated for being more predictive of performance.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Especially if making it very clear to people the purpose of the tool so that they are truthful, right? Like this is not we're not going to look at this when we're doing the next round of promotions and look, we're only going to take the high D's for promotions, right?
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things that's nice about DISC is, at least in my experience within Eric, step in if I'm wrong here, is there is no right style. You just are. And so it's not.
But there's perceptions, right?
Yeah,
people have perceptions of what the right style could be for the role.
For the role, sure. But I think to Eric's point, it's more these tools, and I actually think, and when we talk about management and coaching and a lot of the things we talk about with our community and other people, is this stuff only matters if your intention is to figure out how to work well together, right? Mm-hmm. So the point of doing a DISC assessment with your team is not to be I got to get rid of all the I's or I got to get rid of all the D's, right? Because I don't personally like working with D's. They make me uncomfortable. No, the answer is to say, I'm building a team and my roster is very heavy with this particular type, or is very diverse. So when there is conflict or when there is a lack of communication in the team, I could look at something like our DISCs and say, I understand why my team struggles with, maybe we struggle with terse communications or what is perceived as ego, and it's no, you've just got C's and D's sitting across the table from each other all day, and it's driving everyone crazy. So we need to be more aware of how we communicate with each other, right? That's where I think this stuff becomes really helpful. Is it's basically a way of saying, okay, I've got another tool to understand how to make us work better together because I understand more layers of my team.
Yes, it is. And it's encouraging curiosity. It's encouraging you to step away from seeing differences as bad, and having an HR background myself, I love that this is all about diversity. This is cognitive diversity. So when companies spend so much time focused on the aspects of diversity, valuable though they are, that are more easily quantified, now I'm showing up with this language of cognitive diversity that says, well, a lot of what makes you unique is not easily seen, is more behavior based, is how you prefer to communicate with the world and how you tackle challenges and how you solve problems. And those things are harder to get into a spreadsheet. So let's sit down and have an open, honest conversation about, how we view our strengths and what we bring to the table. Maybe we don't even know what that is, because honestly, so many people out there, copy and paste from other people's resumes to put together their own, because this work of introspection can be so difficult.
People
but
are
just
not
as,
very self-reflective, full stop. Like in life
it's
in
really
general,
hard. And then all of a sudden you take an assessment, which is like looking in a mirror and you're like, oh, I like these things. Oh, I don't like this thing. So it's not true. And it's like, well, that thing may be just as true as these other things that you like, but because it's less flattering, that is probably where you should spend your most time. The fact that you see yourself as confident, but then you show up to a conversation and you're perceived as arrogant, like that is really important that you dig in for purposes of your future career and the people you're, to the benefit of the people that you're leading. You need to be aware of those perceptions.
Yeah, and you have to be aware that like there is a second side of every coin, right? So I think sometimes people forget that like, yes, like I'm a really sensitive person. Like that's really good for a lot of reasons. There's also a lot of downsides to being insanely sensitive, right? Like there just are. Like you can't have it all. You have to there are downsides to being the loud, confident one in the room, in that sometimes people will think you are arrogant or boisterous or a bulldozer. And if you're not aware of both sides of the coin, you can't master the benefit and the positivity of the things that you find as strengths.
But that's EI. That would require people to have EI.
Yes.
Like if we all had
which a lot of people lack.
Yeah. Yes.
There's the flip side of the coin in terms of perception, and you're making a great point about that, but there's also the flip side of the coin in terms of every strength being a potential limitation. That not only in terms of that perception, but I'll give you a real life example. I bring analysis as a strength of mine. I'm very analytical given my own DISC style, which benefits me in countless ways. It does not benefit me when I move into a new home, as I did however many years ago when I was in the South Loop of Chicago and needed chairs to sit on at my island in the kitchen, and went an embarrassing amount of time without chairs because I could not pick the perfect chairs. I felt like I had not done enough research and that anything that I was to decide on, I would just eventually regret. Every time I saw it, I would say I settled for these. And so instead of just buying something to sit on, I had nothing to sit on. That's an example of a strength getting in my way. And so I may not be able to put that into words without a common language, without a language to show up and say, okay, let's talk about your strengths, but then let's also put some perspective around the extent to which these strengths could be working against you, either in terms of how you put them out into the world or how you're perceived by other folks.
Yeah, you also have to be like going back to something you said, Alexa, about, I see myself as being confident versus like other people seeing that as arrogant. I feel like I walk like a very thin line of like, that's a them problem. And like, I'm just going to like continue doing my thing. Maybe I need to go through the DISC assessment and learn some self-reflection and
that actually tells me a little bit about what your DISC style might be. That you think
Does it? Doesn't it? Yeah.
Part of me is like, you know what? Like, let's like stop telling little girls that they're bossy, that sort of thing.
That's a whole different ball of wax, but yeah.
That is right, yeah.
You know what I mean, though? Like, sometimes I'm like, like, we also don't want to, like, we want to let people who are, let's say, high in D, like, be high in D, right? Versus like some people who are like maybe more
people like Eric need me to come in and be like, just buy this fucking set of chairs. Like I promise you it'll be okay. Just buy the chairs.
But like it's just proving that like you need a little bit of Alexa, but you also need a little bit of Eric, because if you went and bought something like just too willy-nilly, then maybe it would like clash, and then you have to
buy lots of
one.
things I highly regret later.
I'm the exact same. We're literally the same person. It's like, I think, Alexa, maybe we need a little bit more cognitive diversity on our podcast team.
That's what guests are for, Tyson.
This is why we have Eric here, like, honestly.
It's literally what we're doing.
I did a workshop recently where a guy stood up and he said, one of the mantras that I live by is often wrong, but never in doubt. Which is great. Like, I love that that's how he lives his life. But you can, with any mantra like that, you can get a sense of how it could get in your way at times. And Tyson, to your point, I've worked with leaders that say, I am who I am, and they're sort of unapologetic, and they look behind and they see a wake of failed relationships, and and they're okay with it. You know,
You
and
get what you
I
get,
almost
you don't get
Back to
upset.
people not being self-aware.
I did a workshop once and I said, is there anything in your profile that you disagree with? And a guy stood up and he said, this says I am stubborn, and I am not stubborn. That's the self-awareness piece.
Yeah.
But you know what? I don't know if admire is the right word, but that person who is just so confident going through life being who they are, I there's a confidence to
We're
that
all
that I think
envious
that
of that person.
I can appreciate.
We're
At
all
the
envious of
same
that person.
time, in my experience, the most effective communicators, leaders, influencers out there are the ones that say, to what extent is what comes naturally working to my advantage? When is it working to my disadvantage? And how is that keeping me from being successful in ways that are meaningful to me?
Yeah.
And that's a
Yeah.
lot of that is not rhetorical necessarily, but a lot of that is up to you to define. And if
But
your definition
that's
is
growth, right? That's the definition of growth and betterment, is being able to say, here's a strength or a thing that I'm good at or that I learned, and here's what I can take from that to then iterate and make it better, right? Either whether that's about yourself or a team or a situation. It's the people who go, I don't know, I'm really good at sales, but I keep getting fired from my job. And it's like, well, are you that good? Or what's right? Or like, oh yeah, like I don't need any of this. And then, the wake of failed relationships and failures, etc., is like staring them in the face and they haven't looked at it. I think what's interesting about these tools, to bring it back to this conversation, is I often find and this is why I found the bird thing so interesting, because it just seemed like an unnecessary layer at first to just make it more engaging. But what I think it actually does, and what I think all of these assessments do, is it allows people to start to tackle these things from a different angle. And so rather than having to say, oh, I know I'm an arrogant little shit, you can label it as, no, part of that is that I am decisive and that there are benefits to being decisive, right? And part of that is that I have influence, and there is a positive aspect of influence, right? There are also positive aspects of bad behavior and just, arrogance in general, right? But it allows people to like almost
Justify their arrogance.
Yeah, I mean, look, a narcissist is going to do what a narcissist does, but if you're not, let's take narcissists out of the pool for a hot second. Like, it allows people to say this is an objective tool, that there is no right or wrong. Now let's talk about your category and see how you jostle with, to your point, the pros and cons of that maybe being true about you, right? Like what you'll find in astrology is that people are always like, this is why I think it's so funny, is people are, oh, I'm a Virgo or I'm a Sag. And it's like, okay, well, which of the characteristics of that are you taking out and assigning to yourself for your own benefit, right?
I feel like
I say I'm a textbook Leo, and that's usually all of the good parts of being a Leo, like the center of the universe, brave, courageous, attention-seeking, blah, blah, blah. And then I'm also like, yeah, but I'm attention-seeking, and I'm the center of the universe, and there's like some real negatives here. But you get to pick and choose, and then you sort of get to chew on that choice, which I think helps people maybe think of themselves and their colleagues a little differently. Because they have a new language to use, to your original point, Eric.
So I feel like
And
next
that's
time you get feedback, just be like, baby, I was born this way. Like, it's like literally like that's what Alexa's saying. She's like,
Me and Lady Gaga.
yeah.
I think we start with that self-awareness piece, but Alexa, you tied it up really nicely. It's learning more about the people that you're working with and understanding that so-and-so isn't just whatever language you used earlier, just a pain in the butt. They just see the world differently, and that's okay. And that's actually more than okay. That should be celebrated, because that's going to allow me to do my best work, because there are going to be relationships and challenges and projects that show up that I'm not suited for, I'm not interested in, fill in the blank. If I know that I have Alexa on my team and she can run with that, then fantastic. I can get out of my own way and give that to Alexa. And then Tyson shows up and, brings a completely different set of strengths. Well, great. Then maybe I can delegate something that I'm not going to do as well or just don't have interest in. Or I can be intentional about that and say, no, wait a minute. This is putting me outside of my comfort zone in a way that actually could be beneficial to me. That, if my natural inclination is to delegate it to somebody else, because I'm somebody who's analytical, this is far too big picture for me. I'm not sure that I can wrap my brain around it. Maybe that Stoic philosophy has sort of the obstacle is the way, the sort of mentality that thing that seems like it is working to your detriment.
I literally wear that stoic pendant around my neck.
Yeah, so there's Ryan Holiday and all these books out there,
Love
but
Ryan Holiday.
the obstacle is the way. Maybe for me the obstacle is this thing that threatens to push me outside of my comfort zone that I would normally distance myself from. In this case, it might be the very thing that I should be moving toward.
Right. Or the colleague that you find frustrating that you're like, oh, that's because they come at this from this other angle. I wonder what it would mean if I could figure out how to see it this way or work with this person.
So instead of how can I close my office door on this person, how can I invite this person in, and sit down in conversation and not to become them, not to change, leopard or cheetah never changes its spots, whatever the terminology is, not to become that person or to become that style, but to learn to grow more comfortable with it and adapt
broaden your horizons
to aspects of that style when it's beneficial for me to do so.
Totally. Yeah, and I think it's really important to remember that these are really good tools for how people see and operate in the world. The other piece that's really important that we neglect all the time in working relationships is the why people do things.
Yeah.
So you can have a really high D or a really high I, but if you don't understand why they are that way or what they are planning to do in their lives that's important to them, that puts you in front of them during the workday, this language will fall short. You will not be able to communicate certain things.
And there's some why certainly built into DISC. So for example, the how for me in terms of how I go about a project might be that I'm going to be dotting my I's and crossing my T's. There's a certain behavior that you can anticipate from me. But the why that's built into that is that I just value accuracy. I have the strong need to be right, or at least not wrong about things. That a D, that someone who prefers that D or dominant style, they're not going to be much about the small talk, and so the how for them is going to be getting right to business and jumping into the bullet points of whatever needs to get done. The why for that D or dominant style might be that they value achievement and they just want so badly to make progress and need to make progress that, any small talk is going to get in the way of them getting things done. So you have that why built in, but we're so much more than our DISC styles. We are the sum of our upbringing, our morals and ethics.
I am what time and circumstance have made me.
Yeah, right.
Said this.
What Tyson said about, what time of day you were born and all of that stuff. There's so much more that makes us who we are. But we need to start somewhere to better understand ourselves and other people. I happen to be a fan of DISC, but there are so many different languages out there that people can sink their teeth into. I think DISC
is a great tool. And I think people should be, and organizations and teams should be having these conversations and learning these languages all the time. Different languages, different tools, because you just never know what's going to stick. I found DISC fascinating and really helpful, and I thought the whole exercise was very cool, and I would highly recommend doing it with a team who hasn't done it before. But there are also other tools that you'll learn different things and you'll have a different language and, it'll resonate more with other people. And I think this kind of stuff is just the work we should be doing. Yeah.
So if people are listening, Eric, and they're thinking, I really want to do a DISC session with my team, can just anybody do DISC or how does that play out? How does that work?
Yeah, anybody does. I mean, most often someone comes to me and says that I feel like I have a team that could operate more effectively, that they could connect more meaningfully with one another, that they could, build more trust than they currently have on the team. They're struggling from recent turnover and they just need to get to know one another better and appreciate the diverse preferences and tendencies that are brought to that team and the different strengths rather than seeing these things as detrimental. And then so, I ask a couple of questions, is this just sort of a one-off thing? Do you want to just have a workshop? Do you really want to adopt DISC as a common language, in which case, you can become certified. There are all these tools and resources available to you. But if you really want to embrace this, let's talk about what lens you want to have in place. Is this a leadership team? For example, do you have executive leaders that you want to have this conversation with? Is it a sales team? Are you doing this with customer service? Is it newer managers who have never been, you two know, I'm sure, we on occasion promote people into supervisory roles that have no supervisory skill.
I have no idea what you're talking about, Eric. That's never happened. Never happened.
Can you work DISC into a new manager training program? DISC is the model. How we apply it is very nuanced. And I get really excited about the strategy. Yes, I can make sure you as an organization have the ability to produce assessments. We can do that till the cows come home. Where it gets fun for me is the strategy behind this? How then are you debriefing those results? How are you working individually in your coaching one-on-one and in group workshops to help people better understand themselves and connect more effectively with their colleagues and honestly, any stakeholders inside and outside the company? What's great about the conversations that I'm facilitating is in the same breath that I'm saying that we can use this information to be better at whatever we're doing professionally, you can take it home with you. Your spouse and your loved ones can benefit.
I'm literally already thinking about like people I've dated and being like, oh my God, he's a C. No wonder he drove me crazy.
No wonder it didn't work out.
Yeah.
No. My husband and I are like complete opposites. Like if when I'm looking at when I'm looking at like the disc stuff, like he's the type of person like when I'm being like, I don't know, loud and obnoxious about something, he's like, babe, shh, you know? So we're like complete opposites, which I think actually like going back to like, you know, you need a little bit of everything in a team, right? So it's helpful to get through things, especially when you're traveling.
Yeah.
I will add, just because I think we've talked about this, but I want to put it in these terms. Homogeneity, however you want to say it, you know, is the enemy of a highly functioning team. And it's kind of related somewhat to what we're saying is that if we're not careful, we can be drawn to people who are like us, that look like us, act like us, value what we value. You know, so Alexa, when you're thinking about people you previously dated, if they were too different, maybe that was off-putting to you. Whereas with Tyson, she seems drawn perhaps to those differences, maybe into that spice, or maybe it just sort of unfolded that way.
He's just really cute.
That does help.
That throws the whole thing off.
That's how we get into trouble, Eric.
Exactly.
You know, but this allows us to think that through and say, okay, if we're not careful, we could end up with a team and even an organization that all looks and sounds and acts the same way. What if we were intentional about who is around the table, who had a voice, who was heard, who is allowed to participate in a more strategic conversation about where we're headed as an organization? Now suddenly you're stronger and more successful in just about every way, as far as I'm concerned. And even more importantly, to go back to the initial conversation you two were having, people are sticking around. We don't have to hoard them. We don't have to lock them in a closet. People will choose.
I love that we're calling retention hoarding now, which is amazing. You just can't fucking win in this industry. Like,
I know.
it's if you don't fire them, you're hoarding them. If they leave, your retention sucks. It's like you can't win. You can't win.
Right?
Anyway, all right. That is a perfect segue into our people problem. Tyson, what is our people problem for the week?
All right. So listener question. I often see that people who are getting more compensation increases or promotions are the people who are the loudest. How can we move away?
Wheel.
How can we move away from a squeaky wheel culture?
I don't know these questions before she says them, so so I'm like, oh, squeaky wheel. What do you think, Eric? Are there personality types that get more or thrive in these situations? Maybe falsely so.
I think that argument could be made that, you know, that you hear that the loudest voices are, you know, the ones that are that attract the most attention. I have a hard time with that myself, you know, because then that number one, that puts certain people at an apparent disadvantage, but also I think it gives a bad name to people who are a little bit more talkative, right? I don't want to leave any conversation having the extroverts feel like they're the enemy of the people. You know?
Well, it's also not about being extroverted, right? It's also about like to the eye, like in this place, I'm like, oh, the sneaky eye. Like you got to watch out for the influencers, right? Because they're the people that are like,
well, as
you know,
it turns out,
doesn't mean you're talkative per se. Just means
that influencing style is what's the word I'm looking for? Correlated with extroversion, as it turns out, right? So that eye influencing style is often, so whatever terminology you use, I don't want anyone walking away from a conversation saying, well, just because I happen to be more expressive, I'm going to be labeled a squeaky wheel. Nor do I want the people who are less expressive and less talkative walking away saying I have no influence. You know, there's nothing there's nothing that I can do.
This feels
here.
like a Tyson moment where I just want to be like, sounds like a you problem.
So this is let me share like a real quick anecdote here, okay? So as you can imagine, when I was in college, I had my hand up a lot. I had a lot to say. I was studying HR. I'm very, very passionate about HR. Anyway, so I always had my hand up to talk and to share my thoughts and opinions and ask questions. So at one point, a teacher, one of my professors, had pulled me aside and said, like, hey, like, totally random, but I just want to let you know that, like, your name came up in the lunchroom the other day about how, like, you know, it's really great that you're so passionate about this, and, like, we see you going really far in HR, so, like, keep it up, whatever. And one of my classmates, a friend of mine, actually overheard it, and her response was, squeaky wheel gets the grease. And I was like, no, you know what? Like, fuck off. Like, I'm passionate about something. Like, that's a you problem. I just happen to be good at this, and I enjoy this. So like you said, you don't want it to be like, oh, Tyson's only getting promoted because she's the one who always talks, or she's talking a lot, or whatever. Like, she's extroverted, so she gets the promotion. Like, no, that person could have actually really worked hard for that promotion as well, right? Like, there's like kind of like the counter argument to, I think, the listener's question, which is that person is actually just really great at their job. That's why they're getting promoted, not just because they're talking a lot, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and also let's not undercount that person's relationship. Like, you don't just get promoted because you're loud. Just like you don't just get promoted because you have the perfect set of skills for the role, right? It is a combination of like relationship, your counterparts that you are in competition with for said promotion, your historical work.
Politics.
Yeah, politics,
Oh, yeah.
which we're going
It's
to
a
do
biggie.
lots. Yeah, we're
We
going
need to talk about that.
Definitely going to do an episode on politics here soon because it comes up a lot. Yeah, it's you know, I agree with you, Eric, that the takeaway from that, I think, is I wouldn't want anyone to think that their ability to communicate and be extroverted and to influence is a bad thing, just like you don't want people to walk away and say, oh, because I'm a C, I have no influence. Like, no, it's a spectrum. Right. Everything's a spectrum. If I could put something on my headstone, it would be like, life is a spectrum. Because
and maybe
none of this...
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Maybe the silver lining to this is that we need to remind ourselves that we have agency, that you don't have to sit by and listen to somebody else standing up for themselves or you know, putting their own name in the hat for a promotion or whatever you define squeaky wheel to be. I mean, you could have just as much of a voice showing up with your own strengths and your own perspective. You know, I think it's really easy for us to say, well, geez, I can't articulate what I would want or need the way that person does. So I'd rather just not try.
Sucks for me. Yeah, exactly.
Right. So I'm at a disadvantage. And I host a number of conversations around networking. And for those people who don't feel that they can network like other people do, who seem to be doing it well, they just take themselves out of the game. And I want to remind you that, you know, whether you call the person a squeaky wheel or not, you have just as much value, just as much of a potential voice as that person does, and you need to use it in your own way. So I would say to that person who appears to be the squeaky wheel, good for them. They're getting attention in the way that they want to get attention. Hopefully it works out for them. What do I need in this organization? What do I need for my career? And how do I go about demonstrating my value and articulating that value and having a voice in a way that's not only going to be effective for me, and compelling, but very authentic to who I am and what my personality style is.
Yeah.
And maybe that's more easily said than done. I think it's a muscle that needs to be exercised.
Squeaky wheels are people too.
Yeah. There's a new bumper sticker.
I think tactically too, like if you are like a manager or an HR person listening to this conversation right now, you need to make sure that you are taking the time to look at things from a big picture so that there's no bias towards the person who's complaining all the time about their salary. So is there a process in place where you're reviewing the group holistically for, you know, who's like performing? So like talent reviews, comp checks, equity checks, things like that. So I do think, like, again, like from more of like a tactical perspective, if HR people are listening to this, make sure that there's like a good transparent process in place so that you don't end up in a situation where people are like, oh yeah, Tyson only got promoted because they're the squeaky wheel. And then there becomes that like negativity around the process towards like, or the culture around promoting and comp increases and that sort of thing.
And I would take it a step further and say, don't, how do I say this? Don't just not give too much weight to the squeaky wheel, but also keep in mind that there are going to be people who are naturally more expressive in general, whether or not they squeak. than other people. And so, for example, if you're sitting around with your team and you get through an hour-long conversation and there are a few folks that haven't said a word, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're disengaged. They may be naturally analytical. They may be thinking through, what is my response going to be? And maybe hesitant to make their voice heard until they're called on. So as a leader, then now we want to start evening the playing field, making it even, by saying, okay, some of you are going to be more naturally expressive, and I know I'm going to hear from you. I can count on those opinions to be expressed. But those of you who are less expressive, I as a leader need to do more to ensure that you are given the time that you need perhaps to think through your response, but then that response is solicited because you are valued. And I want to help you find your voice in some way. Now, suddenly squeaky wheels, they're less off-putting and less intimidating because you are learning to find your own voice and to contribute in ways that feel authentic to who you are.
Yeah. As a high D and a high I who is also a verbal processor.
Oh, good.
You could imagine how squeaky this wheel gets sometimes.
Podcaster of my dreams.
Yeah. But what I will say is I find the best conversations I have to be the ones where someone walks out and asks me if I'm okay. Because they're like, you were so quiet in that conversation. I'm like, yeah, because I shut the fuck up intentionally because I was trying to get you guys to talk. So if someone walks, it's very off-putting the first few times when someone's like, are you okay? I'm like, yeah, I'm fine. I'm just trying to listen for once. Like, I can't believe that's so off-putting to you that you think there must be something wrong.
For once.
Clearly I need to shut the fuck up more. But like, those are the moments where you're like, oh, I can see the benefit of like, someone else's style and being able to recognize my style and pulling it out of other people, right? To say, hey, my S's have not said a word in this conversation. Like, what am I missing? Or my C's are very quiet because there's something we don't understand or they don't want to chime in on. And again, your style doesn't necessarily indicate your personality, communication, introvert, extrovert,
ability,
whatever. But
yeah.
Ability, yeah. But it's like, these are the things you can start to ask yourself, like, especially as a manager, like, hey, is this person a C, but I've got him in a role I expect to have more qualities of an I. How do I work with this person and my own bias towards this function or this role or this way of doing this to actually see if I can get more out of them by working with what they are and what they've got.
And lest our examples are giving people the idea that leaders are only D's and I's, I just want to correct that right off the bat. We could easily be talking, and probably should be talking, in terms of C's and S's being the leaders and having to figure out how to incorporate D's and I's, into the mix. So there's no particular leadership style or, best communication style or best disc style. It's about embracing whatever your style is, understanding when it's working for you and when it's working against you, and caring enough to adapt so that your relationships are that much stronger and more meaningful.
Amen. Eric, where can people find you if they like what you have to say?
I spend altogether too much time on LinkedIn.
You do. I actually think that's partly how we met, actually.
I think it probably is. So really a lot there. Harmony Insights is the name of my company. Everything I do related to DISC is at harmonyinsights.com. And I mentioned earlier, 6 years ago, I started a professional networking community for HR professionals and those who serve them. The goal was just to have a dozen or so people in Chicago, and now we have thousands of members in 14 different licensed chapters around the country. And that's called HR Hot Seat, and you can find it at hrhotseat.com. All free. You're never going to pay for anything that you're involved with, and you can count on a problem-solving conversation, but also very meaningful connection.
Very quickly, can anyone reach out, like anywhere around like the globe? They could reach out to Harmony Insights to chat with you?
One of my favorite DISC workshops I ever did was in Geneva, Switzerland. So the answer is yes.
Amazing.
Cool. Thank you so much for being
Thank
here,
you.
Eric. What a pleasure.
Well, thanks for having me. Great conversation.
Wait a minute, before you leave, take some time to leave us a 5-star rating. We'd really love your feedback. Thanks.
This episode was executive produced by me, Alexa Baggio, with audio production by Ellie Brigida of Clear Harmonies. Our intro music was also done by the wonderful Ellie Brigida of Clear Harmonies. You can find more information about us and future episodes at peopleproblemspod.com or follow us at peopleproblemspod on all things social. Thanks.